Hi, and welcome to our group project on feudalism. This is for our History 101 class for Northern Virginia Community College. Feudalism is the social system in medieval Europe. The key to this system is the exchange of land for services. This land would also be called fiefs, and all the land belonged to the king. He would then exchange the land to a noble for political support. The noble would then exchange a piece of his land with a knight for some type of military support or protection, and the peasant would get a piece of the land from the knight for taxes, basic goods, and crops. This kind of relationship between someone who was higher up and a lower down was called an overlord, and the people receiving the land were called vassals. Which brings us to our next point. Why did feudalism develop after the fall of the Roman Empire? In the Roman Empire, societies were built around statuses and wealth. There was a small amount of wealthy people and the elites. They owned one third of all the property in Rome. They had these huge, lavish homes with several rooms and courtyards. This society used what's called the patron system. This meant that people were appointed for position in government because they were friends with people already in it. During the time of the Roman Empire, the poor people were protected by the military. Once the empire fell, people needed some kind of political system to protect them. There was no longer any laws protecting them, so people turned to the lords to keep the peace and act on their behalf. The willingness to be ruled by the lords led to the beginning of feudalism. While some peasants were free, most became serfs to the lord or vassal, meaning they had to stay with the land and pay very high rents to the lord. People gave the lords royalty and services in exchange for protection and land. Feudalism was a social and economic and political system all rolled into one. It was a system that achieved self-sufficiency. Most people were serfs and almost had no freedom. Because of the state of chaos from the fall of the Roman Empire, people essentially gave up their freedom for protection. People spent a lot of time fearing for their lives, and there was no intellectual advancement. So, how did the practices of feudalism vary across Europe? Places like France started in the ninth century. There was a group called the Capetans, started with King Hugh Capt. He formed a good relationship with the church. The king swore to defend the church, and the church would return and support the monarch. This created fuel for feudalism because people could doubt their kings, but they would not dare to doubt the church. In Germany, feudalism was a mixture of Roman system of patronage and the clan of their society. It was called the Holy Roman Empire. The German Empire was divided into kingdoms and kings to rule its inhabitants, but they all came under an emperor who was elected among themselves. This was the emperor of the German Empire. Feudalism was introduced in England in 1066, following the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest by King William I. All men were the king's vassals. They owned their loyalty to the lord, but to the king as well. With the Magna Carta, the king was to share his power with the nobles. Noblemen were referred as tenants-in-chief and possessed power more than the countrymen, but less than the king. The nobles were mostly Norman. The nobles further granted their land to trusted knights, who took an oath to their noble and the king. The knights were referred as subtenants-in-chief. And like always, the peasants or the serfs were always in the bottom of this list. And finally, we have the rest of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe's feudalism is very similar to the rest of Europe. With that being said, it was the last ones to end feudalism. England ended in 1660, the French abolished it in 1789, and the Russians ended it in 1860. Many historians think it was because of the lack of impact of the Black Plague. Did the characteristics of feudalism change over time? By the 13th century, the increase in commerce and the greater use of coinage changed the way the feudal system worked. Money allowed lords to pay their sovereign instead of performing military services. The monarch's use of mercenaries then meant military services, and thus the barons himself became less impact to the defense of the realm. Conversely, a monarch could now distribute money instead of land in his system of reward. A rich merchant class developed with no ties of loyalty to anyone except their sovereign, their suppliers, and their customers. Even serfs could sometimes buy their freedom and escape the circumstances in which they were born. All of these factors conspired to weaken the feudal system based on land, ownership, and service, even if the feudalism would continue beyond the medieval period in some form and in some places. Feudalism then versus now. The transition from feudalism to capitalism, an idea Marxists have compared over time, is about how the system we live in rose on the western fringes of Europe and then spread. It is the most recent example of how one mode of production changes into another. Urban life dominates, so that even owners of agricultural land are based in town. The great majority of the population works in industries or services. Money plays an absolute central role. Everyone depends on selling something in order to get the means of livelihood, even if most people all they have to offer is just their laborer power. Most importantly, there is no limit to the accumulation of wealth. Everything can be turned into money, and members of the ruling class can own endless amount of it. What drives the system forward is not the consumption of the ruling class, but what Marx called self-expansion of capital, the endless pursuit of accumulation for the sake of accumulation. So what's the difference? Feudalism involves aristocrats and vassals, while capitalism is privately owned and operated for profit. The obligation and relations between lords and vassals and serfs form the basis of feudalism, while profit is the main goal of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't maintain lords and serfs. In capitalism, the subordinate class has the freedom to demand from the employer. What do they have in common? Both the feudal lords and the capitalists divide the overall net income of the company. In feudalism, it would be the farm of some sort, and in some way exploit the workers by not giving him control over his own labor. Both answers to a higher authority to work coherently and economically. So feudalism is the exchange for services and land. It lasted for almost the good part of the medieval times, but slowly started declining when kings stopped relying on soldiers from their lords and instead used paid missionary soldiers or expertise soldiers. This weakened the bonds for feudalism. Other things that ended feudalism was the Black Death or the Black Plague that reduced a lot of the population, causing the peasants who survived to start bargaining for better wages and choosing what job they wanted. The nobility lost a majority of their power over their peasants, who could start buying their own land. Also, what finally ended feudalism was currency. It basically replaced the land power that they were using. This is our works cited page, and we appreciate you watching our presentation.